We are on a mission to create quality living spaces. Some days we hit 1 million. Other days, still 1 million, but who's counting? From New Delhi to New York, or Texas to Tokyo, we are where you are. Affordable stays, vacation homes, you name it, we got it. When the global pandemic changed the world, we changed the future of hospitality. We responded to the first responders, took serious safety efforts. We wiped, we scrubbed, and cleaned to the extreme. We got businesses back on track. All of this with hands folded tight. And then we have our superheroes, designed to provide hotel management solutions and all-round support. Way easier than it looks. Now, how do we do it? We got a bunch of people obsessed with quality stays. Threw in some teamwork and made the dream work. Every single day. Doesn't matter where you live, as long as you stay right. Whenever you're ready. Oyo.
We're delighted to welcome you to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival protected by Dettol here from the front lawn, Digi Palace, Jaipur. It's our pleasure to present the travel session. Taran N, Jeremy Seal and Samira Shackle in conversation with Monisha Rajesh. Travel writing is one of the most ancient forms of literature. But does it have any relevance in the age of the internet, globalization and Google Maps? Travel writer and broadcaster Jeremy Seal's books include Meander, East to West Along a Turkish River, A Fez of the Heart, Travels Around Turkey in Search of a Hat. Journalist and writer Samira Shackle's latest book is Karachi Vice, Life and Death in a Contested City. Taran N is the author of Shadow City, A Woman Walks Kabul. Together, they read from their work, discuss the genre and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on travel writing. Taran N is an award-winning journalist and writer based in Mumbai. She's the author of Shadow City, A Woman Walks Kabul. Jeremy Seal is a British travel writer whose major interest is Turkey. His previous books include A Fez of the Heart and Meander. He has written for numerous publications, teaches creative writing, and also leads cultural and archaeological tours in Turkey. Samira Shackle is a freelance British-Pakistani writer and reporter based in London. Her first book, Karachi Vice, tells the story of 5 ordinary citizens of Pakistan's largest city. Monisha Rajesh is a British journalist and an award-winning travel writer. She's the author of Around India in 80 Trains and Around the World in 80 Trains. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Sunday Times, Conde Nast Traveller and Vanity Fair. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section. Ladies and gentlemen, the travel session. Taran N, Jeremy Seal and Samira Shackle in conversation with Monisha Rajesh.
Hello and welcome to the travel session. It's a real pleasure to be hosting these 3 lovely writers this year. It's normally the festival co-director William Dalrymple who manages this session, and I've often been on it and had a lot of fun alongside fellow travel writers reading from our works, and it's particularly notable this year that we're all at home. We aren't in Jaipur on the lovely big front lawns where I'm sure everyone here would rather wish they were, but we're going to have to make do with that and zoom in from whichever cities we're in. Having already had such a lovely introduction from the presenter, we might just move straight into the session. So I'm going to ask each of these writers to read a small segment from their books. And before they do that, I'd like to ask them all to just explain a little bit about which book they're going to read from, why they've chosen that specific section, and why they feel it's relevant to travel writing. So in no particular order, I'll start with Samira. Would you like to start reading from Karachi Vice?
Sure. So as the introduction said, my book is about It's Karachi. I'm a journalist primarily rather than a travel writer, but I do write a lot about place. So I've reported from lots of different places and a lot from Pakistan, and place is really important in my writing. So that's my perspective on it, I guess. So my book is a work of journalism, I suppose, but it's sort of telling the story of the city through a close focus on 5 ordinary people's lives. That's the idea of it. And the section I wanted to read was one that kind of evokes a place, I think, because I thought that was sort of linked into what we'll be talking about today. So one of the people who I wrote about, one of the 5 people, is a woman who lives in a sort of urban rural settlement at the edge of the city. And it's a community that's been really threatened by illegal land grabbing by powerful property developers. And their villages are kind of being grabbed en masse and people displaced in order to make way for this huge new development, which is planned to be the size of Washington, DC. And the section I'm going to read comes from towards the end of the book when I went to see this new development for myself. So I will read now. I drove to Paria town from downtown Karachi one morning, keen to get a sense of why so many people were drawn to it. The motorway was edged by a flat expanse of sandy, dry-looking earth, punctuated by petrol pumps, massive lorries, and rusting electricity pylons. We paid a toll to enter Paria town, a small fee, but enough to make the compound inaccessible for people like the Cachelos. The roads were noticeably smooth and free of potholes, edged by neatly trimmed hedges. Lush green lawns filled the spaces between intersections, an unusual sight in a city plagued by water shortages. The site was full of half-finished houses and apartment blocks. There were road signs pointing to the hospital, the cricket stadium, sports city, golf city, and synagogue, the cinema complex. One roundabout bore a sculpture of 2 bears poised over a log, then another soon afterwards, an elephant. Signs everywhere urged you to keep Paria clean. In the distance, gigantic plastic lettering reading "I Heart Paria Town" loomed. Construction was still suspended, and although some people already lived there, much of it was empty or half finished. It felt like stepping into a ghost town. As we drove, sometimes roads tapered off into nothingness, merging into the dusty scrubland of the villages beyond. My driver wasn't sure where we were and wanted to ask for directions, but we drove for more than 15 minutes before encountering anyone. "How hard is it to find a human round here?" he muttered. Eventually, we came to the dancing fountain, a pool of water as large as a lake, sparkling in the sun, surrounded by floodlights. I looked at the complicated system of pipes and pumps designed to make the water spurt and dance during an event, and thought about Jannat filling up jugs from the borehole, her arms aching when the power was off and she had to use the hand pump. We drove to the Eiffel Tower, which was partially constructed. It sat atop a mountain of sand, surrounded by steel workers, sparks of welding flying from its joints, despite the fact that construction was halted. I stopped for a moment to stare at it, overwhelmed by the utter incongruity of a fake Eiffel Tower surrounded by freshly planted palm trees and piles of sand. The development stretched out as far as the eye could see, half-built roads that led nowhere, dissolving into the sandy earth. It was so big already. It was unstoppable. The Supreme Court decision was reversed within a few months. In March 2019, it was agreed that Riaz would pay an immense sum, 460 billion rupees or 2.3 billion pounds to the court in return for being able to resume construction. Soon after the decision, I visited Lal Bakhsh Kot. Given Jannat's obsession with my unmarried status, I was excited to share the news that I had got engaged since I saw her last. She clapped her hands in delight. "Has your groom built you a house yet?" Bushra wanted to know. "It doesn't really work like that in London," I explained. "We don't have a lot of space for new houses to get built." "Don't worry," said Jannat, not missing a beat. "There's a lot of space in Paria town. Why doesn't he build you one there?" No one in Lal Bakhsh knew what was going to happen to them. They could not afford to rebuild their poultry farms, which sat there destroyed, the rubble disintegrating in the wind. In the few months that the construction was off, the machinery that bothered Jannat so much at night had been inactive. Now it was back, humming and beeping. When I visited, the dust stuck to my tongue and made my eyes itch. Jannat saw me wiping my phone screen and told me that this fine, persistent dust was because of the construction. The Paria bulldozers with their police escorts had not returned yet, but everyone in the village assumed that it was a matter of when, not if. Thanks.
Very much for that.
Thank you.
I'd like to move on to Jeremy next.
Thank you very much, Monisha, and thank you, Samira, for that reading. Yeah, as was said in the intro to me, I've become a kind of Turkey specialist. I fell in love with the country after teaching there when I was a young man. So a lot of my books have been about Turkey, and the book that I want to read from is called Meander, which is an account of a journey that I took down a river in Turkey, which is actually the classical Meander River. And I was very taken by the notion that there might be a river from which this word comes, which actually gives us the notion of kind of sinuous indirection. The Meander River in Turkey is actually called Menderes in the Turkish. So it was because of that that I actually hadn't clocked that it actually existed there, having read about it in the classics. When I discovered it, I thought, I'm going to make this journey. What I discovered was that it's actually a mess of a river now at parts. In parts it's beautiful, in other parts it's basically turned into a sewage gully. So it became a slightly different journey to the one I was imagining. But what was important for me was to stay close to the idea of meandering, to actually allow myself to be distracted en route and to fall in with whoever I happen to kind of come across. I'm going to read a very, very short piece, which describes one of these incidental meetings. I'm in a small village which none of you have heard of called Chivril, which is in the western interior of Turkey. And I'm heading for an ancient site called Beyce Sultan, which is on what the Arabs would call a tell, like an ancient settlement mound. I don't know what the Indian term is for that, but in Turkish it's a hayuk. So this isn't really about the ancient site. It's actually about what happens en route. So here we go. A palace once stood a few miles south of Chivril by a tributary of the Meander at a site now known as Beyce Sultan. The palace had long since disappeared beneath a grass-topped hayuk, along with all trace of the settlement's original name. The tributary now served as an irrigation ditch. I was making my way there the next morning, walking a road that passed through poppy fields, when a kitchen fitter drew up in a van. Ali was taking his wife and son to visit relatives in the nearby city of Denizli. I squatted in the back of the van, where loose screws skittered among the chipboard offcuts, spanners, U-bends, washers, and tile samples. There were glossy German brochures, but so neatly stacked with careful folds at the page corners that I suspected Ali only ordered their designer taps and baths in his dreams, the one place his clients could afford them. Even so, I was quick to point out, with the fluent insincerity of the grateful hitchhiker, that Ali's kit clearly marked him out as a quality fitter. Ali nodded, though he seemed less keen on discussing kitchens than in learning how his lift, me, might spend Sundays back home. Well, like you, I offered, visiting friends or relatives. A family meal, I continued to walk. Unsatisfied, Ali eyed me in the rearview mirror. And church, he asked. I understood Christians went to church on Sundays. I owned that there were better Christians. Ali frowned. You are a Christian then, he asked, but not a good one. Beyce Sultan was insufficiently distant for getting into, never mind out of, exactly what I was, so I merely nodded. You do know that there are other religions, Ali asked, ones that might suit you better. I told Ali that I was aware of the fact. Awareness is one thing, he replied, slapping the steering wheel. But are you actively looking into the matter? I admitted that I was doing no such thing. You should, said Ali. Everybody needs a religion. He handed me a business card in case my kitchen could also do with an overhaul, before dropping me, mildly admonished, where Beyce Sultan rose visibly from the plain. The carcass of a kingfisher lay in the road, one extended turquoise wing, tipped with cobalt and edged, like a condolence, in black. Thank you.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.
And finally, well, I'm going to do mine at the end, but can I next ask Taran to read from her book?
Thanks, Monisha. Like Samira, I'm also a journalist and not, I suppose, travel writer in that sense, but I also write about place a lot. And like Jeremy, I'm very fond of the idea of meandering, and I love the idea of journeys, which are just sort of maps of exploration. And this is my first book. I have no other book to read from, but it's about Kabul, and I'm going to read from the foreword, which is the very first walk I took in the city. One of the first things I was told when I arrived in Kabul was never to walk. It was early 2006, 5 years after the overthrow of the Taliban government by US-led coalition forces, around the same amount of time that the Taliban had been in power before 2001. Winter was just beginning to fade, and like the seasons, Kabul was on the verge of turning, though we did not know it then. As spring transformed the surroundings, I joined the rush of bodies on the street and took my first walk in the city. My memory begins from a place I almost certainly did not start from. I must have got there somehow. But in my mind, I first recall moving through a bazaar called Mandai on the southern side of the Kabul River. I remember making my way through narrow lanes and shops that extended onto the street. Traders and their carts spilled onto the thoroughfares. Stepping around the piles of dried fruit, tins of cooking oil, and soap. The way the dull sunlight of that rainy spring day filtered through the canopies erected over some shops. The earth was muddy, the market not too crowded, familiar, like the bazaars of cities I knew in India. I recall walking onto a bridge and buying a checked scarf from a young man standing by its railing. His face was barely visible behind his stock of fluttering fabric, which he had tied to a wooden frame resting on his shoulders. He smiled when I took his picture. Behind him were the mountains that encircled Kabul, the Koh Sher Darwaza on my left, the Koh Asmai to my right. Between them, below the bridge, was the river, sluggish with some water, some rubbish. I moved across the bridge, and in the process, I spanned the city's history from the Shahar-e-Kona, or the old city, to the Shar-e-Nau, or new suburbs, ahead of me. Memory returns in fragments. I remember walking through the half-empty streets, feeling the sun on my back. I heard snatches of song on a radio, past a group of young men lounging on a broken sofa they had pulled onto the street. I saw walls with bullet marks, barriers across gates, and the glass panes of shop fronts painted with calligraphy. Under my feet was the slush of the spring. There was smoke rising from the chimneys, and evening coloring the snow on the peaks of the Pahman range on the horizon. Birds on the bare branches of trees singing songs of the approaching dusk. Back in my room, I had tried to brush the mud off my shoes, my clothes, but it had clung stubbornly. I had looked out of the window. Beyond the walls that enclosed the courtyard, the city had changed. It shimmered like a promise, far larger than I had thought. The more I walked, the larger it revealed itself to be.
Thank you, Taran. Thank you very much. Now, finally, I'm just going to do a very short passage before we move on to the conversation and the chat. I'm going to read from my latest book, Around the World in 80 Trains. It's a short segment about when I arrived in Tibet. I think over the 7 months of my travels and 23 countries maybe, Tibet was one of the regions that I was most keen to visit, for obvious reasons that it's pretty inaccessible at the moment, and also because Tibet is one of these places that I think all of us have an idea in our heads of what Tibet looks like or sounds like or smells like, and I had very preconceived notions about what Tibet would be like as a place. And instead of believing everything that I read, I wanted to try and get there myself and see whether I was right about what I thought. And also it was a real lesson in challenging my own preconceptions about the place. For all the border controls and efforts to police the region, writers have always managed to worm their way into Lhasa and document everything from the color of the skies and the sounds of monks at prayer to taking tea with the Dalai Lama. But in recent and turbulent times, the shifting of borders and people, and with them their stories, meant that from one day to the next, Tibet's soil kept turning into fertile new territory for exploration. At this moment, the only thing I was interested in exploring was the underneath of my duvet. My temples had tightened, and mindful of Yuhan's warning that if I fell asleep, I might slip into a coma, I fell asleep, waking more than 2 hours later as we descended into the Lhasa Valley, having missed the best views of the journey. Soft, swayed mountains had moved into the foreground, and the clusters of tents had turned into stretches of grey concrete houses, each with a red Chinese flag in the front yard, a sinister omen. As the train approached the Tibetan capital, Mark stood at the window, his eyes widening at the Mitsubishi garage and a Buick showroom sail past on a street lined with a parade of Chinese flags. A shadow cloaked our carriage as we drew into Lhasa station, and passengers began to gather their bags at the doorway. The wind whispered in our ears as we breathed in air as sharp as shards of glass and looked around the station. Police with rifles wandered around as though a terrorist attack were imminent, and military guarded the exits, scanning bags and diverting passengers for searches. No one smiled, and I began to feel like I'd done something wrong. We were the only foreign tourists on the train and were ushered into a police station to have our permits stamped before being waved off to meet our Tibetan guide, who stood at the end of the path waiting with a sign saying, "Welcome, US guests." There are certain faces that are so imbued with goodness that it's impossible to look away from them. Warmed by the kindness of their thoughts and lined by moments of mischief and laughter, those faces compel the beholder to come closer and to trust. Jampa had such a face. Alert and amused, his eyes lay within soft folds and his smile carved dimples into his cheeks, revealing one overlapping tooth. Jampa wore a hoodie and a baseball cap and carried 3 white katas, ceremonial scarves, that he held on upturned palms before placing each around our necks in welcome. Thrusting bottles of water into our hands, he gestured to his car. "Come, let's go to your hotel and make sure you keep yourselves hydrated." Jem sat in front, chattering away with Jampa, while Mark and I sat in the back, muted by the sight of Calvin Klein, Siemens, and fake Apple stores lining the streets. Posters of President Xi Jinping and Chairman Mao appeared on every other corner, and a billboard stretched over 2 lanes of traffic with a tacky tourist board painting of the mountains that read, "Welcome to prosperous, harmonious, legal, civilized, and beautiful socialist New Tibet." We drove on in silence, not wanting to look at one another. At the traffic lights, boxed in by taxis, motor scooters, a brand new Audi A3 and a Porsche Cayenne with blacked out windows, I looked from the China post office to a Bank of China ATM, next to which a young woman wearing New Balance trainers was buying a drink from a Coca-Cola vending machine, gripping a smartphone between ear and shoulder. A recurring roadside advert featured a whitewashed Chinese woman with one of her eyelids annotated. 2 pairs of eyes showed the before and after images of an eye lifting procedure to make the lids less hooded and slanting. Overhead, the road sign pointed to Central Beijing Road and East Beijing Road. As we approached the Gangyan Hotel, an elderly Tibetan lady shuffled along the pavement, her purple ribboned hair divided into 2 plaits and tied together at the bottom. She wore an ankle-length skirt and a multicolored apron, her walnut cheeks a wind-burnt red. She looked completely out of place. Okay, well, we've got a really nice chunk of time to chat, which is unusual for the travel session because we often get carried away with readings and then have no time to talk. And I think it's great that this year particularly we can have some conversation about what travel means to all of us, given that it's just been an impossibility for the best part of a year. So one of the things that I wanted to discuss, and in fact it's the title of this panel that we're on, one of the tropes that's often flung around is that travel writing has no future. In the age of the internet, Google Maps, and smartphones, do we really need travel writing? Do we need to be buying books by people? Do we need to follow what other people are saying to us, or the ways that they're paving? Or is it something that is going to end up redundant? I'd like to start by asking Jeremy, who's got his finger up.
Yes, I was so excited to answer this, Monisha, because it seems to me that I suppose it's all about quality, that there is so much information out there, but it's not mediated in the kind of interesting ways that is the job of a travel writer. Travel writers, the ambition of good travel writers, I think, is to actually capture something about a place that all those other mediums fail to capture because of a particular focus or whatever it might be. And I've certainly found myself over the last year or so, when we've been very restricted in where we can go and what we can do, in actually falling back on the travel books I love, just to kind of get me back to those places that I cannot otherwise get to. And it seems to me that that's it, that we are able, in creating very particular portraits of places, to go beyond the obvious reach of, as you say, the internet and Google Maps and the rest. Not so much thought goes into those forms of presenting places as hopefully does in what we're able to do.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're absolutely right with that. That idea of it needs to be filtered through a prism until we've got something that's concrete. Samira, yes. Can I ask you how you feel about this? I know you're not a traditional travel writer in the sense that you know, some of us might be, but your book is very much about revealing a place through the people, through the conversations, through the interactions that you have with everybody there. What do you think about? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd agree with a lot of what Jeremy said, and I wonder if Taran, also coming from a journalist background, would agree that I think the kind of points of overlap that I see between journalism and travel writing are about illuminating place, I think, and sort of telling the reader something that they don't already know or that wouldn't readily be accessible, perhaps a sort of showing a place in a new light or contextualizing or sort of explaining in some way. And the best travel writing, I think, that I like to read is that which veers off in all sorts of directions. You know, you have the sort of, you might have the central travelogue and descriptive writing, but you're also learning about not just the experience of being in a place, but perhaps the history or the politics or something sort of unexpected. And I think that there will always be an appetite for that. And of course, you know, as Jeremy said, we're in a moment, and as you said as well, we're in a moment where no one can really travel very much. And so I think there's a huge appeal in reading, whether it's sort of traditional travel writing or journalistic work, reading things that transport you to other places when we are so limited. So yeah, I think that the genre will continue to remain relevant for sure. It's about all the things that you do within the straightforward description of a place. It's a lot more than a sort of Google Maps can give you.
And Taran, obviously this is the same question to you. Specifically, I think with your book, you've approached a place, I mean, it's written over, do correct me if I'm wrong, over 8 years of you going back and forth as someone who's working in Kabul, rather than someone who, like me, traveled out to a specific place just to write about it. Your walking around Kabul has revealed a city in a very different way from what we're used to reading about Kabul. I mean, I know I've read a lot about it during the time that we were sort of at war, and a lot of the correspondence views of things are very, very different from the way in which you write. And obviously being a woman writing about walking around Kabul brings a very different perspective. So could you just expand on that a bit for me?
Yeah, thanks, Monisha. I mean, I think while we were talking, I realized the interesting thing that happened in my process, as you said, I went back and forth from Kabul between 2006 to 13, which happened to be a time of great transformation in the city because it was 5 years after Taliban was overthrown, and then 2014 was when the formal end of the combat operations for the coalition forces was supposed to happen. The interesting thing is, while I was walking around Kabul, I would come back to Aligarh, which is my family home, which is a town near Delhi in north of India. And I would talk to my grandfather about this city, and he had never been to Kabul, but he was the person who really opened it up for me in this very strange way, because he told me there are certain cities I don't know well, but I have never been to, but I know really well. And Kabul was one of them, simply because he was so familiar with the shared literature, the shared culture of this region. And I was just thinking about it, that this is how we are all traveling now, which was how Baba was traveling then, and it was fine for him. But he would tell me things about Kabul that I could go back and sort of look for, and then I would hear other stories that added to what he had told me. So he built this beautiful bridge from his study in India to the city that he had actually never been to. And I think that really shows you the power of literature, of course, as a whole, but also just the idea of how you can get under the skin of a city. what travel writing can really do. I mean, it can take you there in a way that I think the distinction for me is quite simple. I don't understand why I would worry about travel writing dying out as opposed to, well, because I can look on a Google map kind of a thing. Because, well, one is sort of descriptive and informative, and then the other is the experience of going there. And I think some of the best kind of travel writing is about not so much the external journeys, but the internal journeys that people take or that they take you on with them. So, I think for me that is very, very key. And that's what that's what happened in Kabul, really. Like, being there changed the way I see travel, the way I see cities, the way I see narratives, how they're constructed. What even the role of storytelling is when you leave your own place and you're describing somewhere that's far away. And I learned to see how, how we can select the narratives that we consume, how there was a wealth of different stories about the city that was physically closer to where I live, which I hadn't really paid attention to. All of that changed the way I was actually seeing Kabul. So I think, travel writing is just never going to go away, I hope, and I'm quite sure it's going to stay.
Like something you just mentioned there, I was going to ask all of you anyway, and you've just led me into that. Do you think for compelling travel writing, the narrator needs to have some kind of personal relationship with the place or a backstory that links them to a place? Or is it something that can be approached with a completely neutral background? I mean, Jeremy, I was going to ask you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, so I keep putting my finger up. It's to do with excitement, really, Monisha. I'm not sure whether there needs to be, but there certainly needs to be an arresting premise, it seems to me. Certainly when I embark on a travel book, I'm obviously looking for the quality of the writing, but I need to very quickly be convinced that I should invest in the book, whatever it is, that there needs to be a very good reason for the journey. And so long as there is, it's not as if the writer needs to have an innate relationship with that place, but he or she needs to have a very good reason for making the journey. I've just been rereading a travel book I love, which some of you may know. It's called Chasing the Monsoon by a writer called Alexander Frater about India, which personally is one of my favorite books. And I love the ideas that drive that narrative forward, the idea of following the Indian monsoon from the southern tip up to the north, following the monsoon as it unfurls. And I just think for me, it's to do with the strength of the underlying premise or idea, yes.
Samira, did you have any personal links to the regions that you covered in your book, or what was the sort of factor that pushed
you? I did actually. Yeah, it's where my mum comes from, Karachi. So that was sort of what initially interested me in the place. I think when I went freelance in 2012, I moved to Pakistan for a year. I think I'd wanted to live abroad somewhere other than the UK, but largely chose there because I had the personal connection and as well as the professional interest. I wanted to explore my heritage and get to know the place better. And then I think after that, it was the place itself kept drawing me in, and Karachi specifically, although I've worked all over Pakistan, just because it was a place so full of stories and so complicated, and it took a long time for me to kind of properly understand. And yet, in answer to your original question, I don't think you necessarily need to have a connection to a place. I think Jeremy's right about the idea, perhaps, and the premise. In my instance, I think that certainly sparked my initial interest, and I think it can add something. I think also I think returning to a place or sort of having a depth of knowledge, perhaps even more than a particular personal connection, might be quite important. I mean, I don't think that I could have written this book. It sort of builds on research done over about a decade, really, since or the best part of a decade anyway, since I've been reporting in Karachi. And I think that makes it a very different book to if I'd tried to write something when I'd just been there for 6 months or whatever it is. So I think that kind of depth is important. And I suppose I had the impetus to get that sort of depth of understanding because of the personal link, but it's certainly possible to do without that as well.
Okay. Thank you. Unfortunately, we've only got 5 minutes left before audience questions. So can I just ask Taran if there's anything else you wanted to add to that?
We thought we had lots of time, just flew by. No, I think I agree with both Jeremy and Samira that it does. I do feel taken. I would need to feel taken along by the author, and I really, really agree that time is so important in how a city reveals itself, or any place reveals itself. It's definitely much harder, I think, to write about a place you know well than it is to write about a place that you're sort of just passing through. You've been a few times, and you can sort of afford to be a little, just move through it quickly. But I think for me, intention is really important. And this is something I've kind of developed in the last few years, is this need to sort of understand the intention of the author and why are they there and how are they listening to the people around them and what is the quality, what is the tone of their voice when they describe. And as long as there's curiosity, I think I'm there for the ride. I think I really love it when an author who may or may not know, so or may not have a personal connection, or may not begin from a place of tremendous knowledge, but is willing to put in that effort and to have the respect for the people he or she is around to sort of spend the time, do the work. And I think that really makes for spectacular work.
No, I would certainly agree with you that. We've got quite a string of questions gathering, actually, so I'm going to start so that we can hopefully get through them all. Okay, so Samaya asks, what should travel writers keep in mind when considering their own travel site?
Their own travel, sorry, what?
Their own, I think, what should travel writers keep in mind when considering their own travel site? I'm assuming she means in terms of a travel website.
I think Jeremy should raise his hand for this one.
Yeah, let me raise the finger again then, very briefly. Yeah, I mean, I have my own travel website, whose main function actually is just to kind of rave about places I love in Turkey. It was never really built to monetize, which perhaps is unrealistic. It was simply my way of saying, here are the places I love, and here's my kind of offering back to all the people I've worked with in Turkey for, well, I mean, I'm self-evidently older than you guys, and I've been working in Turkey for 30 years, and I've met any number of people in fantastic places. And it was just an attempt, actually, to encapsulate all those places in a site that give them a sort of presence that they might not otherwise have. And I think that's probably very different to what the rules are in terms of most travel sites, which are probably more to do with actually creating another income stream, given that it's hard enough making a living in this business. So that's all I'd say about that personally.
I'm going to have to whip through these because there's quite a few now. Pranav asks to Taran, did being part Pashtun influence your interactions with Afghans?
Actually, I don't want to give away too much of the book, but the whole sort of draw of my Pashtun heritage was not really central to how I related to the city. It did give me the sort of initial feeling with which I approached Kabul, which was great excitement and great, anticipation. It wasn't fear, or it wasn't a sort of apprehension with which I went. I think that in hindsight, that was really important to the relationship I developed with the city. But in the time that I was there, it wasn't such an important thing as I think being an Indian woman was, because as I mentioned before, there was this whole sort of shared common culture that I could draw on. There were so many signifiers that I could share with people there. Of course, Bollywood was a huge part of it, but it wasn't the only part of it. It's much deeper, much wider than that. So I would say being a woman from India was definitely a really, really big influence in how I related to the city and how people were able to talk to me.
Okay. A question for Samira. Pakistan has endured decades of unsettled politics, extremist violence and war. How important and hard is it to find a new voice in a troubled country?
That's an interesting question. I think that what I really wanted to do with this book and more generally in my journalism was not to shy away from that very troubled recent history, which a lot of my book actually centers on, but to kind of I think show some nuance in it. And what I was really interested in was the way that ordinary life continues in and around this kind of quite extreme levels of violence in some cases. People sort of find normal life in the cracks, and that often involves real heroism, I think, and quite simple sort of ordinary actions becoming acts of immense bravery, just kind of going about your work and proceeding about your life. And so that was really what I wanted to show, which I think is something a bit new, or I hope it is, that it's sure there's sort of violence and bombs and so on that I've written about, and also about the police crackdown, which has led to a much more stable situation in Karachi today. But that really sort of showing people who are not affluent, who are not high profile, but who are sort of being very heroic going about their daily work. And I think that is that sort of ordinary, I guess the word resilience gets overused a lot, but that sort of people doing very brave things for not much personal gain was really.
I think we've maybe just lost Samira's connection there for a second. I'm going to, Jeremy seems to still be connected, so I'm
still connected. I'm still here, Monisha. Yeah.
So the next question is from Manvina. She asked Jeremy, if you were asked to come back today and write the same book, what would you need to change? What aspects of Turkey that you covered have changed?
Oh, lordy. Well, that's a really good question, because in fact, Meander, which was the book I read from, was my last but one book. And the book I've just published, which I'm talking about tomorrow, is called A Coup in Turkey, which is actually about the dark politics. So that's what's changed. Turkey's become a much more contentious, difficult and contested place over the last 10 years, to the point that I felt I had no choice but to actually write about that subject. Suddenly it was in my face. As a travel writer, I didn't assume I would ever have a lot to do with politics. But when I considered this most recent book, which is called A Coup in Turkey, I thought, I can't any longer ignore this subject. And so, yeah, that is the problem, of course, isn't it? Places become safer, they become more difficult, they become tougher for writers, they become easier. So you're always working within that flux. And I guess because I've made Turkey my subject, I've seen the way that these changes have affected it over the decades. Yeah.
Okay. There is a question for me, which I'm going to quickly answer. What was the hardest thing about writing around India in 80 trains? I think when it came to the actual writing of the book, I traveled for 5 months around the whole of India by 80 trains. And when I came back, I probably had double the amount of copy that I could have put into the book. And so the hardest thing for me was actually choosing what was going to go into the book and what was going to stay out. And while I think I found a lot of my conversations wildly interesting, fascinating, they helped me unpeel layers of the country, they weren't necessarily fascinating to my readers. And one of the key things for me was knowing that I had an Indian audience, but also a UK audience. And treading that line was very tough, because I could write a description that was quite familiar to a UK audience that would be lost on an Indian audience. Or I remember I referred to yellowing of skin, like a Tesco's corn-fed chicken, thinking, I'm not sure that this is going to be something that somebody in Kerala is going to understand, but I couldn't worry about that too much. And so I just wrote from my own position as a British Indian and hope that that would fit with whoever came across my book. And I think that's one of the most difficult things with travel writing, is knowing who your audience is, or guessing who your audience is, and being able to let go of that a little bit and not worrying too much about who's going to be reading what you're writing, because you can't cater to everybody. People will always take issue with what you say, and you just have to write your truth to the best that you can acknowledge it. So I think that was key for me anyway. That was the toughest bit. Samira, we've got you back.
Yeah, sorry, my internet just disconnected. I don't know why. I'm back now.
I think there was one last question. I've just scrolled back up to for Taran. Mega asks, a city which is forever changing and expanding with the march of time, how was it to visit Kabul one time and then another and witness the changes? Now, I know you don't want to give away too much about your book, but can you give us a very quick answer?
Of course. No, that's a really, really great question, Mega. Thank you. I think it was such a, like I said, it was a very, very interesting time that I happened to be there. It was a time of complete flux, and I was fortunate enough to be able to witness that change over time, like see the seasons changing, see the city transforming. That was, I think, really central to how I was able to write about the city. Physically, the city changed a lot over the time I was there. It became sort of harder and harder to walk on the streets because there were more and more security barricades, higher walls came up, glass walls came up, there were sandbags for guards at the gate. city also became much bigger over this period. It was in 2006, it was still bigger than it had been in 2001, but between 2006 to 13, the population really, really increased. I think it was about 5 million, if I'm not wrong, by 2013, and the city was simply, the infrastructure could just not keep up. And it spread physically beyond the limits of the mountains that traditionally used to be the boundaries. So, and of course it changed in the sense also that, certain Kabulis, my friends, for instance, they found a measure of affluence over this period. They were able to build their own homes in the city, and they'd spent long years living as refugees. So for them, this was a really, really meaningful thing to have, to be able to build a house and to invite me there, for instance, for a meal. It was all of that altogether. But as the question asked, I think to be able to, I would return every time to changes, but I would also return to some things that didn't really change. I would meet the same people, I would meet the same, I had relationships with people there. And I think that was so key to being able to map what had changed by being able to return to the same kind of landscapes or relationships over these years as well.
Thank you so much, Taran, and thank you to all of you. I think, unfortunately, we have reached the end of the session. It's gone really, really fast. In fact, I've just had a message saying time out. so we are done. Unfortunately, I would have really enjoyed to keep talking to the three of you for another hour at least. But unfortunately, I'm going to have to say thank you and wrap it up. But I'd like to invite everyone who's watching at home to say thank you to Jeremy Seals, Samira Shackle and Taran Khan for what I think has been a really, really fun travel session. We don't normally get to chat this much at the end of them. We're always overrun. So it's been a real joy this time to actually get to hear from each of you and hear your views on travel writing. And I'm sure everyone watching at home would agree as well that it's been a really great session. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Please do consider buying these books. They are exceptional reads. Especially at the time when none of us know when we can travel again. So do a bit of armchair travel in the meantime. And thank you for joining.
Thank you for such an interesting conversation. We thank our celebration partner, Diageo. Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Do stay logged on and we'll be back with many, many more sessions for you. As you're aware, the cultural sector has been critically impacted by the pandemic, and anything that any of you can do to support would help. We encourage you to contribute towards the cause. Thank you.
We are on a mission to create quality living spaces. Some days we hit 1 million. Other days, still 1 million, but who's counting? From New Delhi to New York, or Texas to Tokyo, we are where you are. Affordable stays, vacation homes, you name it, we got it. When the global pandemic changed the world, we changed the future of hospitality. We responded to the first responders, took serious safety efforts. We wiped, we scrubbed, and cleaned to the extreme. We got businesses back on track. All of this with hands folded tight. And then we have our superheroes, designed to provide hotel management solutions and all-round support. Way easier than it looks. Now, how do we do it? We got a bunch of people obsessed with quality stays. Threw in some teamwork and made the dream work. Every single day. Doesn't matter where you live, as long as you stay right. Whenever you're ready. Oyo.